So at this point, I just wanted to take a second to go over a concept that we covered already in the previous chapter, and then see how we can sort of incorporate it into our new attributes knowledge that we are gaining today. So in the previous chapter, we talked about groups in group promotion. Similarly, what we can work with is attributes, and we can also promote attributes. So when we're talking about point attributes or point groups, we can actually shift or change those from point class groups into primitive class groups, and the same with attributes. You can change point attributes into primitive attributes, and so on and so forth. So to illustrate that, I just kind of wanted to go over it in sort of a more abstract way, in the theory-like way, so that we can kind of get familiar with this concept, and then we'll apply it to a more larger, more complex example after this. So right here, I've got a grid. I've just thrown down a grid, and I've created a group. And you can see here that my group is signified by these orange dots. I've created up here in my node a little group called my group, and it's a group type points. And you can see I've just created a little bounding sphere, and that's where my point group is, these little dots. So now if we wanted to apply, these two effects to it, we're going to do a mountain to this plane, and we're going to poly extrude this plane. So, but, we're saying, we only want to work on that group. Well, here it's pretty simple. In the mountain, there's actually a group field where we can select from our dropdown, my group. So we can see here that this group field is actually looking for a point group by this little tooltip that pops up. Great. So now if we would just want to extrude these points as well, we can go down to the poly extrude, and you'd think that maybe we could type in my group here. And nothing happens, and it throws an error saying that my group is not a valid group. Why is that? That's because poly extrudes happen to faces, and we supplied a point group, and it needs a primitive group. If you hover over the tooltip here, you can see it needs faces or edges. So this could be a primitive or edge group. Now we have a point group, but it's not a primitive group. I mean, we could go back up here and change this to a primitive group, and it extrudes our polygons, but we've now lost the mountain. It's no longer noising that thing up. So this is where promotion actually comes in handy. We can create a group up here. We'll leave this, we'll set this back to points. My group is set back to points. And the mountain's going to do its thing. And then if we throw down a group promote in between these two, we can highlight this, and we'll select our group from the drop-down list here, my group. It automatically detects the class of the group, so we can just leave that on auto, but we're converting from what is a point group to points right now. We want to actually convert that to primitives. So when we convert it to primitives, you can see that all these dots that we had previously for our group, these dots are now orange squares. And now when we get to the poly extrude, it's happy. It's got a primitive group incoming, and it is able to apply the mountain, apply the promotion, and then apply the extrude. So cool. Now that we can kind of see why promotion is actually handy when we're trying to move between two different functions, I want to sort of draw the parallel with what happens with attribute promotion. So over here, we've got a grid. So this is a grid, and we have created an attribute set to, it's a point attribute that is set to 0. You can see it over here on the geometry spreadsheet. We've got an A attribute, like we set up here. A is set to 0, and then on this side, we've created an add node with a point in the middle, and it has an attribute that is set to 1. And now we're doing an attribute transfer, which you can't see, but if I throw on this visualizer, which is set to A, you can see that it is showing us this nice smooth fall off here. Because the attribute A is being smoothly interpolated across the faces of these primitives, it gives us this really nice gradual fall off. But if I were to go and throw down a promote here, an attribute promote this time, and we'll turn that on. I'm going to just throw the visualizer down here. So after throwing down this attribute promote, and I select my original class A, this is the original attribute name. Its original class is point. I'm going to set the new class to primitive. You can see that this fall off becomes like this more pixelated look. So I'm just going to toggle back and forth. You can see how it was this gradual fall off, and now when we turn this attribute promote on, it has promoted that color. It's averaged that color for each of those 4 points and just assigned it to the primitive as a whole. And you can see down here that our attribute has disappeared out of this point attribute section, and it's moved over to the primitive attribute section. So you can see that A value is there. And if I sort, you can see that there's a bunch of different values for A, and then it falls off to 0. Now, if I wanted to use this, say, apply it to something like our poly extrude, just going to zoom back out here. You can see we've got another poly extrude, and its distance is set to 1. So it's just extruding along the normal of this object. Well, there's a bunch of cool parameters inside here that we could actually use. So if we go over to the local control here, you can see that there is a distance scale attribute called z-scale. We can supply whatever attribute we want here. And in our case, since we actually use the attribute A, we can just name this A. And then it would apply a scaling factor on this distance because we would be supplying that A attribute to it, but nothing's happening. And why is that? It's because it's expecting, if we hover over here, it's expecting a primitive attribute because poly extrudes work on primitives. But nothing is happening with this because poly extrudes work on edges or faces, so we actually need to supply a primitive attribute. And so I'm going to take this attribute promote and just move it over here. And you can see that our extrusion kind of goes away. It doesn't go away all the way. It actually kind of goes down a little bit. It's not fully flattened out, but it's still there. Now, nothing's happening because it's still trying to extrude connected components. So I think it's trying to average all these, all the distance attributes, even though it falls off to 0. So if I change from connected components to individual elements, you can see now that if I wire in the visualizer here, that this is extruding each one of these faces according to that a primitive attribute that we promoted from a point from our attribute transfer up to the primitive level. So that's just a little bit of an overview about the promotion of groups and attributes and how we can kind of use them to our advantage. Sometimes it's just a matter of the order of operations in your network, and sometimes you need to be able to create a point group and turn it back into a primitive group later on, and then switch it back to a point group if you need to. So these concepts will all come into handy a little bit later when we get into a more in-depth example. So keep that knowledge inside of your head and just think about it and digest it, and it'll all get more clear as time goes on. So now we've kind of gone over what promotion is and how it relates to groups and attributes. We're going to put these concepts to the test in the next lesson. The next lesson is a little bit more challenging, but I would invite you to take a look at it, and feel free to take a look at it again later on if it helps you kind of internalize those concepts a little bit more. But so stay tuned for the next lesson. We're going to do, I think, what is the first most Houdini-like looking project we've done so far in this course, which is a fractal extrusion. Enjoy.